Hi everyone, this video is going to go through how to write the Widow's Lament in Springtime essay. And then at the end of the video, I'm also going to go through the poem itself in case you were absent when we discussed it, or in case you are forgetting what we talked about in class. So just to go over the directions quickly, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be reading this poem a number of times, and then in essay format, you're going to explain the message the poet is trying to express while discussing the poet's use of poetic devices. Now, this is really important. So this part where it says you should discuss imagery and connotation and figurative language, and you may discuss any other poetic devices if you feel they are important to show the poet's meaning. All right, so first things first, we're going to read the poem and then go over the directions and talk through some of them together. The Widow's Lament in Springtime. Sorrow is my own yard, where the new grass flames as it had flamed often before, but not with the cold fire that closes round me this year. 35 years I lived with my husband. The plum tree is white today with masses of flowers. Masses of flowers load the cherry branches and color some bushes yellow and some red, but the grief in my heart is stronger than they. For though they were my joy formerly, today I notice them and turn away forgetting. Today my son told me that in the meadows, at the edge of the heavy woods in the distance, he saw trees of white flowers. I feel that I would like to go there and fall into those flowers and sink into the marsh near them. So after doing a quick reading, the first thing you were supposed to do on your planning sheet is to figure out what is literally going on in the poem. So the first thing we need to do when we're figuring out what's going on in the poem is look at the title. And a lot of times people bypass this step, but the title often gives us a ton of information. So let's break this down. It says the widow's lament in springtime. So a widow is somebody, a woman who has just lost her husband. Lament is a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. And then when we think of springtime, we think of growth, we think of new beginnings, we think of things blooming and flowers. And so as we're thinking about this, the first thing we want to figure out is who's the speaker of the poem. So not only is this poem about the widow is actually the one who is talking in the poem. So she's the speaker. She's obviously experiencing a deep grief for the loss of her husband. And this is occurring in springtime. So that helps give us a general idea of what is happening. And now we can draw conclusions, obviously, because it's talking about her husband throughout the poem, that a woman is experiencing grief due to the death of her husband. We also see that she's talking a lot about the flowers and things blooming around her and how it's making her feel. And so it seems like these flowers that used to bring her joy are no longer doing so. So just overall, it seems literally what's happening is this widow is grieving for the loss of her husband, and these flowers that used to bring her joy are no longer doing so. So let's go ahead and look at the next part. So it says, read the poem a little slower to figure out the deeper meaning of the poem. And we just talked about what the title tells us more about. Now, one last suggestion it gives here when you're trying to figure out the deeper meaning is look at the last lines of the poem, and this should really cement our idea of the meaning. So let's go ahead and we're going to kind of go out of order as far as where we're talking about the poem, but let's take a look at the last two lines. It says, and fall into those flowers and sink into the marsh near them. So if we're looking at this language here, she's talking about flowers throughout the entire poem, and it's clear that these flowers used to bring her joy, but they're no longer doing so. And so this line seems to suggest maybe she wants to surround herself with that joy or feel and experience joy again. But then it's followed up by her saying she wants to sink or drown into the marsh, or another word for marsh would be swamp, near them. So this line suggests that maybe like she's referencing suicide here. Maybe she has this feeling that she does not want to live anymore. And so that should impact what we say our overall meaning is for this poem. In class, we shared meaning statements. And so if you are forgetting what you wrote down on your note sheet, I just wanted to remind you of some of the ones that groups brought up. So one group had suggested that when a person loses a loved one, they can no longer see the world in the same way they used to. Another statement was similar to that, but it said when somebody loses a loved one, things that used to bring them joy now bring them sadness. So your meaning statement should have something to do with sadness and grief, because that seems to be the tone throughout. And then also the impact loss has on a person. So again, your meaning statement does not have to be one of those two. I just wanted to refresh our memory in case you were having a hard time remembering what you put on your sheet originally. Now, the next thing you were supposed to do is pick out important connotative words and images. You were supposed to mark them as you see fit, and then you were supposed to try to make notes about how they contributed to the deeper meaning that you came up with. Once you mark the connotative words and images, again, make some notes on those. You can also pick out any other literary devices you see. And then from there, look for any major tones. So when we're talking tones, you're going to refer back to the connotation that you marked and the imagery that you marked, because that's going to help you determine the correct tone. There's also a link on your paper that will take you to a list of tone words if you're having trouble thinking of the exact word you're looking for to describe tone. Again, you want to get past just saying like this has a positive tone or this has a negative tone when you're writing about it in your essay. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the poem itself and talk about different aspects of the poem. Since we already discussed the title, we are going to jump to the first line here. Now, if you notice, when I click on a line here or here, the note for that line will pop out. So when you see it move over, that means that note is for that particular line. So the first line we're going to take a look at is the first line of the poem, "Sorrow is my own yard." Now, this is a metaphor, and we have to ask ourselves what she means by this. So we already mentioned how her yard seems to be something, and flowers seem to be something that used to bring her joy, but no longer do. And the fact that she's saying "is my own yard" seems to suggest that she feels surrounded by her sorrow, and it almost feels as though her sorrow is inescapable, like she is owning her sorrow and commenting that she feels surrounded by it. All right, so let's take a look at the next few lines here. It says, "Where the new grass flames as it had flamed often before, but not with the cold fire that closes round me this year." So the first thing we need to look at is this line that describes the grass as flames and talks about how the new grass flames as it has flamed often before. Now, literally, it's saying that the grass looks like flames, so we're getting some imagery here, but the use of flames needs to be poked at a little bit. So flames or fire often can represent passion, maybe even potentially love, but it can also represent death and destruction. So as you're thinking about why the poet chose to use flames here, think about what meaning you are gathering from the word flame itself, and what do you think that is meant to represent. So if we do interpret it, say, as passion, it talks about how it is flaming now as it had flamed often before, but not with the cold fire that closes around me this year. So if we look at cold fire, this is going to be an oxymoron because these two words seemingly contradict each other. One, just temperature-wise, right? Cold is obviously very frigid. Fire is very warm. And so cold brings to mind things like winter. Sometimes we also use the word cold to describe somebody who lacks emotion or who is cold-hearted. It could also represent death, whereas fire suggests warmth and, as we said before, potentially passion. So again, if you're talking about how flames maybe represent passion, the fact that it's now described as cold fire could represent a loss of passion or a loss of love. And then this imagery here is interesting because she says the cold fire that closes around me this year. And this line itself seems to suggest this feeling of being trapped or suffocated. Now, as you're writing this first paragraph, you want to point out some of the language that we just talked about. You want to say what tone is coming across through that language and how the poet is using different poetic devices to get to the meaning that you had come up with. Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and move to the second stanza here. So it says, 35 years I lived with my husband. The plum tree is white today with masses of flowers. So again, we want to look at words that we feel have a specific connotation or that have a specific meaning behind them. So the word white is used constantly throughout the poem, and the color white typically symbolizes purity, innocence. It can also represent surrender, so like lifting the white flag, peace. If it says peach there, that should be peace, new beginnings. And obviously, we see the color white taking on many different meanings throughout literature and throughout different stories. So again, decide and think through why the poet may have chosen to use the color white here. We also see language here that says the plum tree is white today with masses of flowers. And then it repeats, masses of flowers load the cherry branches. Now, the term or the word masses and then the word load here seems to suggest a heaviness. And so maybe these words could potentially be symbolic of the heaviness or the longing the widow feels for her dead husband. So as you're reading through the poem, pay close attention to the words, what they mean, and the tone that they're giving off here. Think through also why the poet would have used masses and load to describe these beautiful flowers. So again, think of how the woman in the poem used to view flowers. And again, we talked about how it seems that the flowers used to bring her joy, and now how she feels about the flowers. And why then would she have used these terms that convey a sense of heaviness? So again, look at the language and how it might convey her feelings. We then see later on, it says the masses of flowers load the cherry branches and color some bushes yellow and some red, but the grief in my heart is stronger than they. So the speaker is using some personification here to show that her grief is overpowering these natural images that used to bring her joy, right? So the cherry branches, all the color in the bushes, all these things used to bring her joy in springtime, but her grief is stronger than they are. All right, moving along here, it says, grief in my heart is stronger than they, for though they were my joy formerly, today I notice them and turn away forgetting. So it seems in this line that maybe the poet is suggesting that she doesn't want to remember the joy, like she is intentionally turning away from them. Maybe she's feeling guilty for the joy that they used to bring them and maybe starting to experience that joy again. And she doesn't want to experience that given the sadness she feels over the loss of her husband. Now, as you're thinking about writing your second body paragraph here, you want to again look at some of the specific language that's being used, what tone that language is creating. And then you also want to see if there are any other figurative language or poetic devices that the poet is using to create meaning in this poem. Another thing that would be good to note, so we talked about tone in the first stanza as well. So when you're talking about tone, it'd be good to describe whether the tone is remaining consistent, is it changing in some way? So it's always good to note if there's a shift in tone in a poem. All right, moving on to our last stanza here. It says, "Today my son told me that in the meadows at the edge of the heavy woods in the distance, he saw trees of white flowers. I feel that I would like to go there and fall into those flowers and sink into the marsh near them." So we did discuss the last two lines at the beginning of this video. So let's just go ahead and start at the top. So the fact that she mentions her son and that he was reminding her, telling her of flowers, and that he's describing where to find those flowers, maybe he recognizes her grief and is trying to console her and get her to experience joy again. It's also interesting in the next line that it says, "at the edge of the heavy woods." So again, we get this heaviness coming across. So usually when we describe woods, and maybe they're woods that are full of vegetation, it's usually we don't use the word heavy to describe them. So it seems very intentional that the poet's describing the woods as being heavy here. So think about why he keeps on using this reference to heaviness. So at the edge of the heavy woods in the distance, he saw trees of white flowers. Again, we're seeing white again come up here. I feel that I would like. This line makes it seem like she is unsure. The speaker of the poem is unsure. So being unsure, she wants to go see the flowers and fall into the flowers and sink into the marsh near them. So she's thinking about it. She thinks she might want to do it, but she feels unsure. And as we interpreted the last line, it seems, "and fall into those flowers," seems maybe she wants to embrace joy or experience joy again, surround herself with joy. But then it's followed up with that line where she says she wants to sink into the marsh near them, which seems to suggest that maybe she wants to drown or not be on this earth anymore, sink into the ground. So these lines definitely stand out and show us just how deep the widow's grief is. But then again, she does suggest that she's unsure she wants to do this. So as we're looking at these last few lines, think about what the speaker is trying to get across about her grief. So maybe she's trying to get across that she wants to experience joy again and falling into the flowers. But then she also is so sad and she seems to be unable to get past her husband's death, so that a part of her maybe wants to experience joy, but another part of her doesn't want to live anymore because of his death. So that's just a quick overview of some of the lines that you can be referencing. Again, when you write your third body paragraph here, make sure you're referencing specific lines, what they mean, what tone they're getting across, any figurative language you see, and then in each paragraph, you need to be explaining how the imagery, how the connotation, the tone, the figurative language contributes to the overall meaning the poet is trying to get across. And remember, if you have any questions, make sure you're reaching out to your teacher.